My name is David Neumark. I'm a professor in the Economics department in the School of Social Science. We're a department of around 25 faculty. We cover all the fields in economics. Personally, I'm a labor economist. We are the biggest major in the school and I believe the university, which is common at many institutions. I also direct something called the Center for Economics and Public Policy, which tries to increase linkages between research and policymakers. One of the things we do that's, I think, of a lot of interest to students is we bring to campus very distinguished researchers to talk about what their research has to say about current policy issues. A lot of my research in the last 10 years or so is focused on minimum wages and anti-poverty policy generally. It's a controversial topic. It has been since the minimum wage started 70 years ago. It still is. There's really two elements to what I do, I think, that stand out. One is a lot of research that establishes quite clearly that although minimum wages offer some benefits, if you're a low-wage worker and you keep your job, you obviously like a higher minimum wage, but it comes with costs. There is some job loss associated with minimum wages, and that's something policymakers have to think about trading off against whatever they think the benefits are. The other major component of that research is studying what the connection is between minimum wages and poverty. If you ask people casually sitting around a dining room table, do minimum wages help the poor? The answer inevitably is yes. I know that. I've tested that many times. But the answer is actually quite a bit more complicated. And the reason is partly because some people are adversely affected by the minimum wage. Some actually do lose their jobs. But the richer issue is we have to think about who are low-wage workers and are they really all in low-income families, or are quite a few of them in high-income families. Many students at UCI and elsewhere are not from low-income families. Many of them in high school and perhaps even now work for minimum wage jobs. And ask yourself, if you're a policymaker, I'm raising the minimum wage, maybe some upper middle class kids are going to get a higher wage because of that. Are we really accomplishing what we want, or aren't we? And the research says that it's actually quite complicated, that many of the gains from minimum wages go to the people we're not really particularly trying to help, that is, secondary or third earners in high-income families, and it's much harder to identify an effect whereby we increase incomes in very low-income families. The reason is really twofold. One is a lot of low-wage workers are not in poor or even low-income families, and the other is, if you look at why families are poor, the principal reason is not low wages, although that certainly doesn't help them. The principal reason is they don't have any workers. And raising a minimum wage for a family with no workers just means there's now a higher wage job you don't have and doesn't do you any good. So getting people to work is really the best anti-poverty policy. That sounds simplistic, it's hard to do. One thing we know helps more than anything is a booming economy. You look back at the end of the Clinton administration when the economy was really booming in the late 90s. First time in really decades that people at the bottom, people with low wages, gained relative to other people. Inequality actually fell. One of the only times in the last few decades where poverty fell substantially. That's the best thing we can do. The other thing we can do is encourage policies that induce or encourage people to work, rather than what a minimum wage does, which is effectively, and oversimplifying a bit, taxing an employer for hiring a low-skilled worker by making them pay more. My early research on minimum wages was focused, as was many labor economists' research, on just the employment effects, right? If you force the wage up by government fiat, essentially, does employment fall a little bit? It's a debated point, but the answer is pretty clearly yes, it does cause some job loss. Employers do employ fewer low-skilled workers when you do that. I was once, though, in the mid-90s, when this was a highly controversial topic, I was testifying at a Senate committee, which is an interesting experience, and you don't often learn much from that because many people think all you're doing is hearing speeches. But one of the senators said to me, suppose you're right, suppose actually minimum wages do reduce employment, does that mean we shouldn't raise the minimum wage? And it was one of these sort of eureka moments. I said, well, that's a really good question, right? We haven't really been studying that. Obviously, we could raise the minimum wage, a few people could lose their jobs, a lot of people could get a raise, it could help a lot of low-income families, could help a lot of poor families. And I basically said to the senator, I don't know the answer to the question. It's something economists really haven't focused on very much. And it kind of redirected my research for a while into actually studying these distributional effects. Personally, I was hoping the answer I was going to find was, yeah, despite the job loss, actually these things are net beneficial. The gains to people who get higher wages outweigh the losses to others, but the research actually doesn't appear to show that. It's an interesting question how research on policy relevant questions can make a difference. A lot of my research points to generally adverse effects of minimum wages or an absence of beneficial effects. Some of my colleagues tease me. They say, you know, you seem like you're losing, right? Because they keep raising the minimum wage anyways, to which my clever response is, well, it would be higher if not for my research. So it's a little hard to say in that particular realm. I do think the research gets discussed in policy circles, it gets discussed in the media. When you hear policymakers talking or the talking heads who talk about policy, when they point to claims that minimum wages reduce employment, minimum wages don't help the poor, they are sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly referring to the work. But one thing I've learned over the years is that just doing research on policy questions, if that's all you do and you write your papers and publish them, which is what professors do, and then move on to the next thing, you don't have much influence on policy at all because there's always competing studies. There's studies by objective academics that can disagree. Then there's also a whole sort of, in economics at least, a whole slew of quote-unquote think tanks that have their own agendas that are putting out studies that are really pushing a particular point of view, and that happens on both sides of almost every debate. And if your study just becomes sort of one of the undifferentiated mass, policymakers, reporters just write about whatever they want. So I've certainly found that being willing to talk to reporters, to write op-eds, to go and testify, can help at least clarify for people what are the good studies, what are the bad studies, what should we believe more, what should we believe less. I can add actually another dimension in which research has made a difference. Unrelated to minimum wages, I did some work on urban enterprise zones in California. Enterprise zones are basically policies, and a lot of states have them, where you identify kind of distressed urban areas, we sort of all know what they are, and you create a system of tax breaks, typically tax breaks for hiring. You make it cheaper for employers to hire workers who live in those areas. And the idea, of course, is to try to increase economic activity in these areas where economic activity seems quite distressed. California is spending a lot on their program, around $500 million a year, relative to a state budget of roughly $100 billion. We did a very thorough study in the late 2000s that confirmed what a lot of research had shown before, but I think more rigorously or more convincingly, and showed that the program really wasn't working. We were spending a lot of money. It had just become a tax break for businesses, so businesses loved it, because why wouldn't they? But it wasn't really creating jobs. It wasn't creating jobs in these distressed areas. This sort of percolated its way through Sacramento for a few years, and actually this past summer 2013, Governor Brown actually killed the enterprise zone program, citing this research as showing that it actually didn't create jobs. It was just costing taxpayers something and getting nothing in return. He has set up a very different kind of system with different kind of tax breaks. Remains to be seen whether those are effective. But that's probably the most concrete case where research has actually made a difference. It would be nicer to find research that says, here's a great thing, let's do it, but it's also useful to say, here's something that's not working, let's not keep spending money on it. Another area I've done a lot of work in, actually this goes back to my dissertation, so the work I originally started with was on discrimination, focusing mainly on discrimination against women, but also discrimination against other groups. That naturally led into an evaluation of the policies that we use to combat discrimination, and the most controversial one is affirmative action, right? The courts and state legislatures have been debating this for a long time. Affirmative action, put in a very simple fashion, gives some benefit in hiring to groups that we think have suffered from discrimination, and critics of affirmative action argue that those quotas, those functions essentially just reverse discrimination. It's a very controversial topic, and it happens in both the workplace, that is in hiring decisions, and it happens in it's controversial with respect to university admissions. Many universities have systems to try to bring in a more diverse pool of students. So I did a lot of work a few years ago really trying to sort through all the evidence and what does affirmative action do. The conclusion we come to is it actually does something. It's not an irrelevant policy. That's always one thing that's useful to establish. We kind of categorize it, both in education and in employment, as you could imagine there being two kinds of affirmative action. There's sort of what the critics fear, which is sort of reverse discrimination, quotas. You know, you have to hire a certain share of blacks, you have to admit a certain share of women. The other is what we call benign affirmative action. What we mean by that is policy that forces employers or schools, if they choose to do so, to in some sense look harder to try to find the qualified candidates among the groups that are typically underrepresented. That can impose a cost on firms. It might be cheapest if I have an all-white workforce to say, bring in your friends, have them apply for jobs. Affirmative action says if you're not hiring some minorities, you might get into some trouble, you might lose federal contracts. But what the policy does is not so much operate as a quota, which I think most Americans would think is unfair and courts would rule illegal. But what it says, it just pushes employers to pursue different ways of finding potentially qualified employees. So as a result, you do find boosts in minority hiring, to some extent female hiring. You don't find, though, much evidence at all that they're actually admitting into universities or hiring into the workplace less qualified candidates. And even if they are, they're making remedial efforts. So employers might, when they hire minorities, they might have somewhat lower qualifications on paper, but they're putting in place probationary and training systems and promotion systems to basically try to compensate for some of these things. So it looks more like a policy that is trying to, I think you could say, level the playing field by helping those who are less advantaged move upward, rather than look like a policy that's more consistent with what some of the real strong critics of affirmative action have to say.